Hello and welcome to the Rooted Podcast by Pursuit. I am Joseph Johnson and this is
Amanda Ballard.
And we're back with part 2 on the Holy Ghost and Fire prayer meetings that happen at our church. If you've not listened to part 1, please go back and do that because Amanda talks about all the ways at which the whole season affected your life and the fruit that came from that. But now we're going to get into what it did to our church and some of the miracles that happened during that time. So if you are not coming out to Pursuit, I want to encourage you to come out and join us. We meet the first and third Sunday of each month at 6 p.m. and we'd love to have you come be a part of that. So, all right, let's get into it.
Okay.
So we ended with this is what God was doing in your life, and you were starting to hear Him clearly, and He took this burden and this weight off of you, and it was just absolutely incredible.
Yes.
And now we're going to transition to, well, when did you start to see fruit in our church? When did you begin to see, okay, this is actually impacting our church now?
Yeah, so I tell this story a lot too, and I think this is one of the most important moments, like for me. And I tell this story a lot. I just told it at ladies' conference, but I'm going to tell it again because it's my favorite, one of my favorites. Top 3. We were here one night. The Spirit had moved so strong, and we had all ended up in the floor in front of the altar there in front of the pews. We still had pews at the time. And we were all just sitting in the floor under a weighted glory. I mean, Annette describes it as she couldn't open her eyes. The glory was so heavy in this building. We were just sitting in the floors, and I was sitting up against the altar with my back up against it. Christy was sitting right in front of me up against the front pew. We had direct eyesight like you and I do right now. And it had grown quiet in the building. There were times we would just sit in silence, sometimes for an hour, 2 hours, just silence. And the glory of the Lord would be so heavy, you couldn't do anything but sit. And we were sitting there, and all of a sudden, you could hear a downpour of rain on the tin roof of this building. It was just like a deluge. And I looked, and she looked at me, and she mouthed the words and said, "Is that rain?" And I went, pouring the rain. You could hear it. And instantly, the Holy Ghost spoke. And He said, "Do not fear the sound, for that is the sound of the abundance of rain that I am bringing to this house." That was the exact words. I'll never forget it for the rest of my life. He said that I am bringing to this house. That's what He said. In a few minutes, the rain stopped. Shortly after, when we all got up out of the floor, I walked to the side door in the sanctuary and opened it dry as a pin. It had never rained outside. It was not raining. And it was raining on the inside, but not on the outside. That moment for me is pivotal because, one, He didn't say the abundance of rain I'm bringing to you. He said the abundance of rain I'm bringing to this house. Now, up until that time, like we were talking about earlier, the Lord was taking all of us individually through restoration and cleansing and just through a whole time of repentance. He was bringing revival into our hearts because He was about to bring revival into this house. And He used us, not that we're anything, but at that time, I didn't come willing, but I had became willing. We were willing to let Him use us. I think most of us, probably all 4 of us, if we admit it, when we came, we weren't really that willing. We were all just kind of like, okay. But we all became these vessels that was like, use us, Lord. Because He had took us through such a time of repentance and a time of cleansing. And I think that moment is pivotal when you talk about what happened in this church, because He said, I'm not bringing it to you, I'm bringing it to this house. And so fast forward to about a month or 2 later, we were all here on a Thursday night, and by this time, a few more people had started coming. Which we could go on with these stories forever, but one thing that had happened that I remember so clearly is Sean Moody came one night to pay his tithes because the church was still closed at that time. And he had left work and came down, and he would bring his tithes down and leave them at Mom and Dad's. And he saw a bunch of cars, and he got out and came in because he thought maybe somebody was here practicing music, he said. And he walked in, and the Lord just had him laid out in the back of the building in the floor. He didn't know what was going on, but there was us 4 women in there praying. And he said when he walked in, the presence of God was so strong it scared him. And he said he got and put his head under a pew and hid because he didn't want to leave. He wanted to see what was going to happen. And he hid under a pew like a child. And he'll tell you about it. But he had been coming. Moo had started coming. Moo came to the first one. That's a whole nother story. But Moo showed up in the middle of the first one, and God wrecked him. So
he was actually telling me a little bit about it. We were walking out yesterday, and he was just like...
Yeah, he came to his first one. He had left his wallet here, and he came. He had been here working on some sound stuff because the building was closed. And he came to get his wallet and walked in and was like, what's going on here? Yeah. But the Lord had actually told Christy that another person would come that would need something. And he got what he needed that night. But so Moo was here that night. There was a few of us here. So fast forward to the night that we all end up in the baptistry. I don't know how we ended up in that dry baptistry.
He was there that night, wasn't he?
He was there that night.
That's why he was kind of sharing a little bit.
Yeah, he was there that night. And we all ended up in the baptistry. I don't know how or why, but that's where we ended up. And the Lord just wrecked every one of us. We were there in that baptistry for hours. People are listening to this thinking, these people are nuts. I thought we were nuts. But the Lord moved that night. And the Lord delivered Moo in particular. I'm sure that was the story he was telling from something that night. I don't even know what, but you felt it when it left. And it was just wonderful. He texted me that night and was like, thank you all for obeying the Lord. It was wonderful. But the Lord moved on all of us that night in the baptistry to a degree that I cannot tell you. That following Sunday morning was the change.
So we had church that Sunday morning.
We had church that Sunday morning.
We closed down due to some outbreaks at times.
We did.
We really tried not to stop.
Service, yes, that was it. So we were back. Church was back. We were having 2 services at this time. And I was coming to both services at the time, and I still do sometimes, but at that time I was coming to both services every time. And we came in on that Sunday morning for the 9 o'clock, and as soon as I walked in the door, there was a different feeling. It was a different atmosphere. Something was different, and I knew it. Mm-hmm. And the 9 o'clock was really good. And when the service was over, we were all just kind of hanging out. We would clean the building in between services. Mm-hmm. We had cleaned. And we would wipe all the pews down. We had pews then. And we would pray over each one while we were wiping them down. And we were doing that. And people started coming in. And I was out in the foyer. I had cleaned the doors and the door handles and was doing all the things out in the foyer. And we would pray over the door facings while we were cleaning. And people were coming in for the 11. And Kathy Shanks walked in. And as soon as she walked in, she looked at me and she said, "What is that?" And I just smiled. She said, "There's something different in here this morning." Well, my mom came in right behind her. And as soon as my mom walked through the new foyer into the old foyer, as soon as she walked through that doorway, she started speaking in tongues. And she was like, what is in here this morning? She was like, "How was the 9 o'clock?" I was like, "It was good." And she was like, "Something's different in here." People started walking in the building and they were shouting. And then I see Christy pull in the parking lot, and she gets out of her van and she's running into the building. And I said, "Why are you running?" And she said, "I don't know, but I was coming down Tate's Creek and the Lord was telling me to go. She was like, "I had to get here. I couldn't wait to get here." And she just was running into the building. And that was another prophecy, because the Lord said people would come running to get here. And that morning, everything shifted. People would walk in and immediately start feeling the Spirit move. And it was just an outpouring that morning like I've never seen. That was the morning that we took probably 125, 150 people through a dry baptistry that was not dry at all. We call it the baptistry service, but we took people through the baptistry, and people's lives were forever changed, but our church was forever changed. Something that was so odd and so weird, mm-hmm. and people probably thought these people have lost their minds, but we were here at 2 o'clock in the afternoon still. I remember Sarah Stallard from one was laying in the baptistry, just out. Yeah. She had been there for probably an hour or more. Like, church was over, and they were like, "Can we go home? What are we going to do about Sarah?" You know,
should we pack her out?
Yeah. What are we going to do? Yeah. But that day changed our church completely. It changed lives, and I don't know why. But if you ask me what is the pivotal moment, it was that moment. It was the night that the Lord told us the abundance of rain was coming to this house. But that day, everything changed. People came with an expectation. We had people walking because people would say, "What is that? What's going on?" And I would say, "Well, we had this service, we had this prayer meeting here Thursday night, and we were all in the baptistry, and there was just a spirit and an overwhelming." And Kathy Shanks said, "I'm going to walk through it right now." This was before church ever started. I was like, "Okay." So her and Felicia Delph, who was coming to the prayer meetings at this time too, her and Felicia and Sean go back there and walk through. Well, they are automatically just laid out in the Spirit. And church hasn't even started yet.
But they're out cold in the baptistry.
Yeah, and they finally come out, and other people are like, what are they doing back there? Because they can hear them. And I'm like, well, we have
Go find out.
Yeah, go find out. Well, Sean started telling people, come back here, walk through there and see. So church hasn't even started yet, and there are people walking through this dry baptistry, and they're shouting, and they're,
and we can't explain that.
We can't explain it. There's no explanation.
No, it's just the presence of God
was so strong.
Yes.
It was unbelievable. And on that, I told this the day of the baptistry service. I told it, I've never been one to take the mic and talk, unless I'm announcing an event. And that day I took the mic and I said, you may not understand what's happening here, but on the Thursday night of the prayer meeting when we were all in the baptistry, I was standing, there at the edge and was looking out towards the sanctuary. And when I did, and I've told this, I saw a visible white cloud. It looked like just rolls of marshmallow. I don't know, just white cloud. I'm not talking about a haze. I'm talking about a visible white cloud begin to fill the back of the sanctuary. And it just started moving and coming towards us. And I watched it. And when it reached the baptistry, it just dissipated. And we all that was it. That was when we were all out on the floors and laying on the steps. And I remember Annette was completely laid out on the steps. Moo was down in the bottom of the baptistry on his knees. Like, I don't even know where I was. I don't remember. But when that cloud got to where we were, everything changed. And from that moment, our church changed. It changed. And I told that in that morning. I said, I saw a visible cloud in this sanctuary. And I can't describe it. I can't explain it. And I know people probably think that's crazy. I don't care. I lived it. I know what I experienced, and I know it's real. And I feel it burning inside me because I can't. But from that day, from the baptistry service, our church changed. Because that day, I'm going to tell you why, people surrendered. They didn't care that they were walking through a dry baptistry.
They just wanted him.
They just wanted it. They didn't care that they looked silly.
Yeah.
They didn't care that if the world was watching us, they were like, these people are nuts.
Yeah.
They didn't care. They surrendered. That's what we did. And that's what people did. And I still to this day have people tell me that service changed my life. That day changed my life. I will never forget it. The service was ending. We had a great move of God that morning. And we were standing across the front, some of us were. Dad had prayed for some people, and the service was ending. We'd had a service that day. And it was pretty much done. And the Lord kept saying, take them to the baptistry, take them through the baptistry. But again, I was standing there. Nope.
They're going to think I'm crazy.
They're going to think I'm nuts. And the Lord said to me, take your shoes off and go through the baptistry. That is another time in my life that I audibly heard the voice of God. And that's only been a few times. But that day, I audibly heard, just like you and I are talking right now, a voice in my ear said, take your shoes off and go through the baptistry. And I looked over at Christy and I said, the Lord says we're supposed to go through the baptistry. And she said, then let's do it. And Trina said, what'd you say? And I said, the Lord says we're supposed to go through the baptistry. She said, tell your dad. I said, no. And she said, Mandy has something to say. And I said, Dad looked at me and Christy said, Mandy, he has his shoes off. And some random man standing next to me had taken his shoes off.
Ready.
And I hadn't said to anybody, the Lord said, take your shoes off. I hadn't even told Christy, who was standing right next to me. And she said, Mandy, he has his shoes off. And I knew. And Dad said, what is it? And I said, the Lord says we're supposed to go through the baptistry. And he said, okay. And I said, but we have to take our shoes off. Joe, people just started throwing their shoes off. You think I'm exaggerating. I'm not. I literally was walking to the front. I was in the front, but I was walking to the baptistry door. And I turned around and I saw people sitting down taking their shoes off. It was like, we're going. We don't care. And I went first. And I opened the door, and I had on a pair of heels, and I just kicked them off. And I started up the steps to that baptistry. You know, you've been back there. And I started up those steps. When I got to the first step, no, I get so excited. People are going to think, I don't care what they think. Yeah. When I got to the first step and I stepped up on it, I felt water. Obviously, there was no water.
Yeah.
I was in a hallway, but I felt water to my ankles, ankle deep.
Yeah.
I stepped up on the next step, and I felt it come up my leg. I got to the next step, it was past my knees. When I got to the top, I could feel it to my waist. I felt like I was standing in water. I don't know how to explain that to anybody other than from my foot to my waist, I felt cool sensation. I was standing in water.
Yeah.
But when I got to the top step, the glory was so heavy, my knees were buckling. The people behind me were holding me up because I couldn't stand. I mean, all I could do was moan and cry in the spirit. It was such a time of travailing that I can't tell you what it was like. Everybody behind me was experiencing the same thing. The women behind me were trying to hold me up and they were falling themselves. We finally, minutes later, I'm sure everybody out in the sanctuary was like, what's going on back there? We finally made it into the baptistry. We were having to help each other. Yeah. That's how strong the glory of the Lord was. And we got down into that baptistry and people started coming through. But my mom was first. And I think the Lord did that on purpose. I think everything he does is on purpose. That was purposeful. I think because she's the mother of this church and the head of this church. When she went first, it showed, one, she was supportive, and two, it showed I'm taking the head of the church and I'm going to take her through first. And she started down into that baptistry. They carried her out of it. I don't know if you've heard the story. Yeah. They carried her out of the baptistry. And when she got, I was looking at my dad and I was saying, we need help, because we couldn't get her out. Yeah. So we finally got her out. They carried her out. And as they were getting her out, the women who were lifting her out, when they touched her, they would fall out. It was the worst mess you ever saw. They got her to the other side and were trying to get her down the steps. And I looked at Josh Martin and I said, come help me. And he came around and tried to come in there and get her. And when he stepped to the side, there's a space between the steps and the wall. He picked her up and he was trying to carry her down those steps. And the Lord slew him out between the wall and the steps. He fell down. And he was just in that crack. He's a big boy. Yeah. There he was, down in that crack. And shaking under the power of God, so strong. They finally got her out and got her to the front pew.
By that point, it was just a war zone back there.
It was a war zone. And it never stopped for the next 2 hours.
Oh, that's incredible.
But it was such an outpouring. I will say this. I feel like that morning is when everything in the church changed. Yeah. And that was all brought on by those prayer meetings. It just was. It was unbelievable.
And obedience looks offensive or crazy to people who are in unbelief. Mm-hmm. It just does.
Yeah.
And people may hear this and be like, that's crazy. Okay, well, when you're in faith, when you're experiencing faith and you're going after God, nothing looks too crazy. Nothing looks too wild. It's just...
Yeah, and the people that were coming through the baptistry were people that usually stand back on Sunday morning with their arms folded. Like, people were running to get up there.
People were hungry for something.
They were hungry for something they had never seen before. They had never experienced before, as were we when we started these prayer meetings. But I feel like that was the pivotal moment when things began to change. After that, I felt like the face of the church changed. I felt like we became a more community-minded church. We've always been a community-minded church my whole life. This church has always been a community-minded church. But I felt like our love for our community and our desire for our community shifted.
And with that, the fruit of that was our effectiveness became more pronounced.
More pronounced,
I
100%.
So. Yeah.
100%, yes. And I think it was obedience because, we'll have obedience rather than sacrifice for sure. But the obedience was it was the sacrifice. Yeah. And I'll die on that hill.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So at that point, that sent our church on a totally different trajectory.
Totally different trajectory.
Prayer meetings are still going on though. Mm-hmm. And can you maybe tell me 2 or 3, if you want to kind of hit the high points on a bunch of them, whatever you want to do, but just some of the miraculous things that you saw, like some of the crazy things that you saw. I remember when Sam would come home and share some stories, and I would just be like...
One of the things that I think about a lot is something we started doing was we started praying over prayer blankets. And we had ordered a whole case of blankets from Amazon, just little fleece blankets. And we had started praying over these prayer blankets. And we would send them out to people. We would anoint them with oil and pray over them. And each individual blanket, we didn't just put them all on the altar. We would take each blanket, we'd put them in our hands, we would saturate them with oil, pray over them, and send them out. Kayla aunt was one we sent it to. She was miraculously healed of cancer. Just amazing things like that I stick out in my mind. People that were healed and delivered. There was a lady in Michigan. Her niece had told her about our prayer meetings. She had cancer, and her niece had told her about our prayer meetings and that we were doing these prayer blankets. And her niece texted me one day and said, would you get me a prayer blanket to send to my aunt in Michigan? Absolutely. So I did. I took it to her. They sent it to her in Michigan. And she had been suffering terrible with nausea and stuff from her chemo. The Lord completely healed it. I mean, and she says it was that blanket. My mom's sister-in-law, cancer. We sent her a prayer blanket. They weren't even saved at the time. She insisted on having that prayer blanket every hospital visit, every chemo treatment. She's cancer-free today. Like, and are you saying it was the blanket? No, it was the Lord. And it was the faith and the belief that we had. People were healed because of our efforts and because of our faith and our belief, and that we did what God called us to do. And so those are the things for me that are most important. But just the things we saw, the night that Sam talks about the most was the night she came, and we had a miraculous outpouring that night here. We were here, I don't know what time we went home. It was way up in the morning. But I saw your wife shake under the power of God, and she said, as she had seen those things, she'll tell you this herself, she wasn't quite sure if some of that was real. Yeah. And that night, the Lord said, I'm going to show you. Yeah. Yeah. And she was in the floor beside me. I was in Dad's chair, and I had sat in that chair. The Lord had put me in that chair. I was unable to move for probably an hour. The weight of the glory of the Lord was so heavy on my body, I just sit there. I couldn't move. I would try to lift my legs. It felt like they weighed 2,000 pounds. Like there was no moving. He didn't want me to move. He just wanted me to see what he was about to do. And Sam, the Lord had laid her out in the floor on the stage praying. She was praying, and she had ended up on the floor beside me in that chair. The heat from her body radiated so strong that I could feel it. I felt heat off of her body, and her body literally shook under the power of God. I've never seen anything like that. Never, and still haven't today. I've seen people shake under the power of God, not like this. Her body pulsed on the ground, on the ground. Unbelievable. Like, that was one of the best nights. That night, Kayla, she had started coming to the prayer meetings then. Kayla Hall, our children's pastor, was there, and the Lord moved across on her, and she floated across that stage. She'll tell you that. It was like her feet weren't even touching the floor. It was like she was walking on water. That's the only way I can describe it. She floated across that stage. She danced under the presence of God in his glory for probably 20 minutes. And it was like her feet never touched the floor. I've never seen anything like it. It wasn't a few seconds. It was, her body was sore the next day. It was like a workout. Her face turned a color I had never saw. We still talk about that. The glory of the Lord was on her so strong, her countenance changed. I saw people's countenance change. Like, you don't see that. Yeah, so we saw things that, I could just tell you on and on. I seen God deliver people from depression. Sean Moody, he'll tell you about it. The Lord completely relieved him. I'm not speaking of anything they don't tell of themselves, because I wouldn't tell anybody's private stuff, but the Lord relieved him of hurt and bitterness and anger from his brother's death from so many years ago. And he will tell you about that. But the Lord relieved him of all of that one night. It was like every time we would pray for him, Annette would run her arms, like down his arms, and she was just calling things out. And it was almost like you could see it visibly fall off of him. And he walked out of there with a whole different look on his face, a different man. He's a different man today because of that night. I seen the Lord deliver him and set him free, but I could visibly see it happen, like watch it happen. Jay Davis's wife, came one night in just terrible pain, and we prayed for her in the floor, and she laid in the floor for 45 minutes and shook under the power of God and got up completely different than she was when she got here. And I'm still believing for Jamie's total healing, but the Lord moved on her that night like I've never seen. Spots on her legs visibly disappeared. I could go on and on. The things we saw in those meetings, and again, people are going to think we're nuts. I don't care. We would go home at night, and there would be just sparkly, glittery things on our bodies, on our faces, because we would all bring blankets, you know, because the presence of God was so strong in this building. You would leave glowing under it, and people are like, okay, whatever. It happened. Yeah,
when you see it, like I saw that when we were in Brazil, and it was like you can't unsee it.
You can't unsee it.
The presence of God comes over someone. I don't know what it is,
but it never changes. You can see it.
You can see
and you can't never unsee it. No. And one night we were here, and Trina has pictures on her phone from it. She took pictures of it, but we still had pews back then, those green pews. And there were water drops on the pews, big water drops, where water drops had fallen, and you could see the water on the pews. And there's no explanation for that other than the glory was falling in this house, and it was visible on the pews. Trina took pictures of water drops on the pews.
I see those one day.
Yeah.
I've not seen them.
Yeah. I mean, those things. And people are like, okay, whatever.
Yeah.
That's what happens when you surrender to him. When you say, here I am, Lord, show me your glory. He showed us his glory. We walked in a mist one night. You could feel it on your face. We played in it like children. But
talk about that. Sorry, talk about that just for a second.
Yeah, so we were here one night. It was about 1 a.m.
Yeah.
That we keep the lights low in the sanctuary when we're praying. And we were in here, and the lights were low in the sanctuary. We were praying. The glory of the Lord had felt so strong. And Rico and some of his church had came and joined us, and they had all left. And it was just kind of our core group was left. There was 8 or 10 of us here. And we were all leaving, but we didn't want to leave. It was like the Lord was having us linger, but we didn't know why. And the glory of the Lord felt so strong again in what Annette would say, you couldn't even hold your eyes open. It was so strong. I mean, she would sit with her eyes just like, it was so heavy.
Yeah.
And we were all sitting up on the stage. We had all ended up on the stage just sitting around. And Annette said, do you see that in the back? And I was like, yeah, what is that? And Trina said, it's like a mist or a cloud. And I think Sam was here that night, and we all were just like, what is that? And somebody, I don't even remember now who it was, said, maybe Felicia, I don't remember, said, I'm going to go back. I'm going to walk through it. It was almost like you were a little afraid of it.
Mm-hmm.
And she was like, I'm going to walk. I think it was Felicia. I'm going to walk through it. They started going back one by one and walking through it. It got thicker. It was so thick, you could wipe it and your face would feel wet, almost like a mist or a humidity. You know how that's what it would feel like. And you could feel it on your skin.
Wow.
You could smell it. It was the sweetest, most aroma, like just an aroma of sweetness. I can't describe it. There was a smell.
Yeah.
Like it wasn't just the feel, it was the smell. And you know what I mean? And
had you ever smelled something like that before?
No.
Okay.
Never.
Never experienced anything like
that
before?
Never like that before. And we smelt it a couple times afterwards, but never before. And that night, it was like children playing in the fog. You're going to laugh, but to the point that some of them would go back there and be like, can you see me now? It was like,
I think that's crazy.
You could visibly walk through it, and people are probably like, these people are nuts.
No, that's awesome.
The experience was so overwhelming. That's one of the best nights. Yeah. We laughed because Felicia Delph ended up under the grand piano. Just laid out forever. Her kids would sleep in the pews.
Yeah.
Ron and Derek would bring Easton. He would sleep in the pews. Like, I mean, that's just
what happened.
This is what happened. The night that the back doors opened and shut, we were all laid out on the floor. That night is unbelievable. Hutton was here. I don't know what happened that night, but somehow we all ended up in the floor face down. I just remember sitting in Dad's chair and thinking, I have to get on my face. And we all ended up in the floor face down. And somehow Brandy Linville and I ended up down in front of the altar on the floor face down, almost head to head. There was maybe a walking space between us. And everybody in the building ended up on their face. I don't know how, but we did. And Derica Coates told me, she said, I was scared to death that if I raised my head up and opened my eyes, I would see the face of the Lord. She said, I've never felt anything like that, but I knew if I opened my eyes, he was going to be standing right in front of me, and I couldn't open them. And it's almost how I would describe it too. The fear of the Lord was so strong because I knew he was in our midst. I knew he was in that building, and I knew if I opened my eye, you would have seen him face to face. And she said, Derica laughed, she said, I just remember laying in that floor saying, don't let Easton wake up, don't let Easton wake up, because I think he'll see the Lord and he'll kill him. She said, I was scared to death he was going to wake up and see Jesus. Yeah. Like, that's really how strong it was. But I remember laying in that floor, and we talked about it afterwards. It's like I felt a presence of a person walking, and I literally felt the person walk by my head. It was almost like I could feel my hair move. And I had my blanket, because we would all wrap up in blankets, I had it over my head, just laying there in the presence of the Lord. Every person in that building was on their face. And I believe, without a shadow of a doubt, I don't know how crazy this sounds, that the Lord was walking right between us. I know he was. I'll never be convinced of any difference because every person in that building would tell you that they thought if they opened their eyes, they would see his face.
Yeah.
And when everything was over and we were all kind of setting up and talking about what had happened, but while we were laying on our faces, it was storming outside. And the building, sometimes this building, you can hear it shake. The back doors rattled, and all of a sudden they burst open. Everybody said that had to be the storm. Well, we were inside. The storm was outside. But the back doors that come into the sanctuary flew open. They just flew open and stayed open. And I can't describe that, but it was the glory and the presence, I believe, was so strong in that room that it burst the doors open. And we all talk about that. But when we were all sitting up talking about what was happening and what was going on in that room, I said, who was walking around? And everybody was like, not me, not me, not me. I said, did anybody get up and walk around? And Dalton said, no. He said, I was on the stage. Nobody was moving. And I was like, somebody was walking. I felt them. And everybody was like, nope, not me, not me. We experienced things that I could talk about for the rest of my life.
Yeah. Like we're only touching like
just the skimming.
Yeah.
We're skimming.
Yeah. So let's see. We've just got just a few more minutes here. I got so many more questions.
Go ahead.
I feel like we're gonna have to do another one of these. Yeah. So many times around like big revival movements, you hear talk of like the angelic and the demonic and things like that. So, real quick, like, was there any experience for you all with like the angelic or the demonic or anything like that occurred during these?
Absolutely, 100%. So,
not that we want to focus on that, but these are just things that happen.
They do happen. So we were here one night in prayer, and it was a wonderful prayer meeting, and literally you could feel and hear a sound, and the Lord said to us through the Spirit not to fear the sound, which he said that to us a few times, but that night he said, do not fear the sound. And he even spoke and said that it was the sound of angels' wings encamped about us, protecting us from that which was trying to invade. And that night, you could almost hear a rustling. It sounded like wind moving in the building. And the Lord said it was the sound of angels' wings. And Trina will tell you about a time that she was in prayer on the podium, and the Lord had slain her in the Spirit, and she opened her eyes and saw angels standing in the balcony. She visibly saw them just standing there, like keeping watch. Yeah. And the Lord said he was keeping watch. Vonda Bishop called her one night and said that she was in prayer while we were in prayer, and she was in Indiana, and that the Lord showed her angels encamped about our whole building, that he just showed her that in a vision. And so those are angelic things, but there was a couple of nights that we fought some demonic stuff. We had a lady come and we fought some demonic things. And
so did you begin to see people being delivered in the presence of God from the demonic?
We saw a lady delivered from a demonic spirit here one night. We called Dad. He came up. I called him. I texted him and said, you need to come up here. Yeah. And he came. And he walked in, and I will never forget that John Michael was here. And John Michael, when it was all done and everybody was leaving, he said, I want to be him when I grow up. I said, me too. Because, and not because he's my dad, but he carries such an anointing that when he walked in, this demon was manifesting. And I know people don't like to hear a lot of this, but this demon was manifesting. And when my dad walked in and he rounded the corner, and she or whatever caught sight of him, it cowered. You watched it. And he walked up in authority and just said, you have no place here. You have no authority here. And he took care of business, and it was done. And it was, because his anointing, not that we didn't carry it, we do. But when he came in, that demon cowered. I mean, you could see it literally cower at his words. Because when he spoke and said, you have no authority here, that was it.
And that individual,
was delivered
and saw the fruit of that deliverance after that. I mean, there's been times, there was a night here that, and people don't like to talk about the ugly parts, but there are ugly parts. There was a night here that we literally fought a spirit, and literally. So when you say fought, like what do you mean by that?
What I mean by that is you could feel a heaviness that night. It was like no matter how much we prayed, no matter what we did, nothing was breaking through. There was just there was a heaviness, there was a hindrance. And we began to pray against the hindrance and against, we were praying that against chains, and we were declaring and decreeing that those hindrances and those spirits had to leave. They weren't welcome here. There was no place for them here. And Trina physically saw a figure standing out in the foyer. It wouldn't come into the sanctuary, but it was standing out in the foyer. And we began to go out into the foyer. We anointed our hands with oil, and we started praying over every doorway, every facing, every room in this building, all the way from the top floor where we're at now to the bottom, to the youth room. We opened the doors. We went outside. We took 7 laps around this building, praying, speaking in tongues, declaring freedom from anything that the enemy was trying to bring against the ministry and against the move of God that we had here. We prayed for every leader in this church, every ministry in this church. We prayed over Pursuit. We prayed over Encounter. I mean, we went to every office in this building and prayed. I mean, the nurseries, the kids' rooms, all of it. Yeah. And then when we were done with that, we took 7 laps around this building. There we were, 10 or 12 of us outside, making 7 laps around this building, shouting, praying, speaking in tongues, declaring and decreeing that it had no place here. And when we walked back in, that bondage was gone, that heaviness was gone, that darkness was gone, and we had one of the best prayer meetings we've ever had that night.
Some warfare, intercession.
Warfare. One night, and I know we got to go.
We'll land it here.
Yeah, that night, not that night, but another night we were here and it was storming outside. A lady in our church had been battling a battle that she had been going through for probably 10 years with depression and anxiety, and one of her children is a really bad drug addict, or was. She isn't now. She was a drug addict, and they were battling and fighting that. It was at its worst at that time. And I know all about that, and how hard that is. And we began to pray for her. And we had never made it out of the foyer of the church. We had never made it into the sanctuary. We were praying for her in the foyer, and it was storming bad outside. And one of the ladies opened the door to the church, and another lady ran and held the other one open, the 2 front doors. And they were standing there with the doors open. The rain is coming down outside. And we're praying and telling those things they have to go. And one of the ladies that was praying for her was calling those things out, the depression, the anxiety. And the Lord spoke and said, it was shame. And she started praying for shame to leave and to flee her. And we started just rebuking that and coming against it. And we were praying, like fighting spiritual warfare with her and for her, because you have to do that. You have to do it together.
Yeah.
And Joe, one of the most amazing things I've ever saw in my life, we stepped out through those doors, and it's raining. We don't care. And we're standing right there in the doors. 2 ladies are holding it open because they opened the doors and a symbol that those things had to leave.
Now these are the doors that are going out where there's no covering over the church.
There's no covering over the church.
You walk out, you're getting drenched.
You're getting drenched.
Yeah.
And we're standing there, and they had opened the doors in a symbol that those things had to go. They had to flee. They couldn't be here. And we had the doors open, and we were praying over her, and she just broke. You could see it. When they called out shame, she just broke and began to sob. And one of the women was holding her, and she was crying and sobbing like a baby. And I looked up, and right on top of the church, we have those lights that shine up on the steeple. So the lights on the roof. I look up, and it was the most amazing thing I'd ever seen. That as those women were praying, I could see almost a funnel forming. And in the rain, like the wind blowing it, and it's going up. And it's making almost a funnel. And it's just going like this. And when they were praying, it would build up, and they would stop, and like she was just crying, and they would think they were done, and it would just get stronger. But when they would start praying, it was like it would go and dissipate. They would stop, and it would build back up. And then they would begin to pray again and call those things out, and was praying in tongues and praying in the Spirit. And as they would do that, that cloud that was forming, that funnel, would dissipate and disappear. We watched that happen 3 times. Because I said, are you all seeing this? Well, the 2 girls holding the doors were like, oh my gosh, what is that? And then the women in the foyer, and then the 2 women that were praying with her and holding her, they weren't letting up. They were just praying in the Spirit, praying in tongues. I mean, and just battling for her. And she was sobbing and weeping like a baby. And the rest of us stood there and physically watched spiritual warfare take place with our own eyes. And we watched it happen. Now, I know that sounds nuts, but I watched it 3 times. Yeah. And it would be like, and then when the more they would pray and the more they would, intercede, it was intercession, it would and disappear. And then they would let off, and they would try to start comforting her and talking to her, and it would just
come back.
come back. 3 times that happened.
Wow.
And that night ended with her laid out in the floor of the foyer. We weren't even in the sanctuary.
Yeah.
Just broken under that. But all of that. And from that night on, she'll tell you herself, things changed in her and in her situation.
That's incredible.
Yeah, it was unbelievable.
Oh, Mandy, I wish we had more time.
Yeah.
This is incredible.
Yeah, it was wonderful. That's one of
yeah.
the best nights that I can recall.
We're gonna have to do another one of these. We'll have to.
Yeah.
Because there's so much more to talk about.
There's a lot.
Yeah.
It's a lot, and it's a lot to unfold. But I want to say this, and I do have to go. Abby has surgery today on her mouth. I want to say this. I heard Kevin Wallace say something that I thought today on the way here. I thought, I'm going to share that. I heard him say something. He said, the Lord doesn't bless us so we can say that he did. He doesn't show us his power. He doesn't show us his glory. He doesn't show us these outpourings so we can say, I felt good for 10 minutes. I felt good for 2 hours. That's not why he does that. He does these outpourings. He gives us these outpourings of his Spirit so we can be witnesses, so we can share it, so we can spread it, and so others can see what he's shown us. And they can be encouraged, and they can realize that it's for them too. And when I heard him say, the Lord doesn't give you his glory just to give it. He gives it so you can be a witness. I thought that's exactly why all of this happened. All of these things happened so we can further his kingdom. Yeah. So we can have those tongues of fire that video told me to pray for. Yeah. Because we have to be a witness for him. It has to further his kingdom. It has to. That's why he does it. It's not just so we can feel good. It's just not so I can say, I felt the Spirit. Yeah. So I can say, I felt the Spirit, and then I shared it with others, and they felt it too.
And something we really didn't touch on at all in this was that we saw explosive growth in our church after this.
Explosive growth.
Like, yeah. There's no system. There's no, I mean, I'm all about, let's put plans in place and let's do this stuff.
Too,
and let's do, you're an organizer. You like doing all those things.
I'm an event organizer.
Yes.
That's what I do.
So, yeah. But there's nothing that can grow a church like the presence of God.
There's nothing.
The signs, the wonders, and miracles that came from his hand exploded our church.
Your programs and your events, they're wonderful things, and they develop a sense of community in your church, and they get people in and help them stay grounded, and it makes them feel welcomed and wanted, and that's all important. But without the presence of God, there's nothing. There's nothing but a bunch of programs. And I'm for those things, for all the things, 100%. Yeah. But without a move of God, there's nothing. And I've grew up in a church where I've seen it my whole life. I mean, we could go on all day about the things I've seen. But the things I saw in those meetings changed me completely.
That's wonderful.
Yeah, it made me a different person.
Well, we'll land it there.
Yeah.
So, thank you, Mandy, for coming on.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks for having me. I love to talk about this stuff.
Yeah, and we'll get Mandy back to do more of this. So, but in the meantime, go do what Jesus said.